The email arrived at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, interrupting my review of grant applications for the Henderson Foundation Educational Excellence Program. The subject line made my breath catch. Application status: Henderson Foundation Doctoral Fellowship. My assistant had forwarded it from our main inbox, probably not realizing the significance of the sender's name. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Madison Parker. My sister. I stared at the screen for several minutes, my cursor hovering over the message like it might detonate if I clicked too quickly. The Henderson Foundation Educational Excellence Program. The scholarship fund I had built from nothing after years of rejection and financial struggle. The program has helped over 200 students pursue advanced degrees in the past 5 years. The program my own sister had just applied to, apparently having no idea who really controlled the purse strings. The irony was so perfect, it almost made me laugh. Almost. I opened the application with trembling fingers, scanning through Madison's carefully crafted personal statement about her passion for environmental law and her dreams of fighting climate change through legal advocacy. Her undergraduate transcripts from Northwestern University showed a solid 3.7 GPA. Her LSAT scores were impressive. Her letters of recommendation glowed with praise for her dedication and potential. On paper, Madison Parker was exactly the kind of candidate the Henderson Foundation had been created to support. Bright, motivated, passionate about making a difference in the world. The kind of student who deserved a chance to pursue their dreams without the crushing weight of educational debt. But Madison Parker was also the sister who had stood silently in our parents' living room 8 years ago, watching as they handed her a check for $60,000 to cover her undergraduate expenses, while simultaneously explaining to me why funding my doctoral program in educational policy was too much of a financial risk for the family. The same sister who had accepted their generosity without question, never once suggesting that maybe their daughter who had graduated summa cum laude from Yale might also deserve their support. The same sister who had spent the last 8 years enjoying the career opportunities that came with a debt-free college education, while I had worked 3 jobs and lived on ramen noodles to fund my own academic pursuits. I closed the application and leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline from my office on the 47th floor of the Merchandise Mart. The Henderson Foundation occupied an entire floor of premium office space, with conference rooms named after famous educators and a reception area filled with photos of scholarship recipients at their graduations. 5 years ago, this had all been just a dream scribbled in the margins of my dissertation notes. Now it was real. Real enough that my own sister had applied for funding, apparently never bothering to research who actually ran the organization she was asking for help. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. James Harrison, my co-founder and the Foundation's academic director. Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. Need your input on the doctoral fellowship decisions before we finalize anything. The doctoral fellowship decisions. Madison's application was one of 12 being considered for 3 available spots, each worth $75,000 over 3 years. Enough money to cover tuition, living expenses, and research costs without requiring recipients to take on debt or work multiple jobs just to survive. It was exactly the kind of support I had needed 8 years ago, when I had sat across from my parents at their kitchen table in Westfield, New Jersey, explaining why a doctorate in educational policy was not just some expensive hobby, but a pathway to meaningful research that could impact educational equity for generations. I could still remember every detail of that conversation. The way my father had set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision before explaining that graduate school was a luxury the family couldn't afford. The way my mother had avoided eye contact while listing all the practical reasons why I should be grateful for my undergraduate education and focus on finding stable employment. The way Madison had sat at the same table, fresh from her Northwestern acceptance letter, saying nothing while they explained why her education was an investment in her future, but mine was an irresponsible gamble with their retirement security. 3 weeks later, they had written Madison a check for her first year's tuition and housing. Full payment, no loans, no work-study requirements. Just a family investment in their younger daughter's potential, while their older daughter was left to figure out her own path forward. I had figured it out, obviously. 4 years of doctoral coursework while working as a teaching assistant, research assistant, and weekend tutor. 2 years of dissertation research funded through a patchwork of small grants and personal savings. A defense scheduled around my job at the Chicago Public Education Research Institute because I couldn't afford to take time off work. The whole experience had been a masterclass in financial stress and academic perseverance, but it had also taught me something valuable about the barriers that prevent talented students from pursuing advanced education, not just the obvious barriers like test scores or academic preparation, but the subtle ones like family expectations and financial support systems that operated according to unspoken rules about who deserved investment and who didn't. That understanding had led to my dissertation research on educational equity and family dynamics, which had led to my job at the Research Institute, which had led to my first published paper on socioeconomic barriers to graduate education, which had attracted the attention of wealthy philanthropists looking for evidence-based approaches to educational funding. And now, 8 years later, I was sitting in a corner office, controlling a budget that could change students' lives with the stroke of a pen, including, apparently, my sister's life. The foundation's selection process was rigorous and objective. Every application was reviewed by multiple committee members using standardized scoring rubrics. Academic merit, research potential, financial, need, and commitment to using their education for social good. We had built the system specifically to avoid the kind of arbitrary decision-making that had shaped my own educational experience. But looking at Madison's application, I realized that all the objective criteria in the world couldn't eliminate the human element from the equation, because no matter how fairly we designed our process, I was still the person who would ultimately sign off on the final decisions, and Madison was still the sister who had benefited from a support system that had been denied to me. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my thoughts. "Dr. Thompson, the board members are here for the fellowship meeting. Dr. Rebecca Thompson." The name I had legally changed to 8 years ago, partly for professional reasons, but mostly because I wanted to build my academic career on my own terms, separate from family expectations and disappointments. Rebecca Thompson had earned her PhD through determination and sacrifice. Rebecca Thompson had published groundbreaking research on educational equity. Rebecca Thompson had founded a scholarship program that was changing lives across the country. Madison, Parker's sister, had been deemed unworthy of educational investment. But Madison Parker didn't know that Rebecca Thompson existed. I gathered Madison's application along with the other fellowship materials and headed toward the conference room. Dr. Harrison was already there, along with our 3 board members. Patricia Chen, a retired federal judge, Michael Rodriguez, a former Chicago Public Schools superintendent, and Sarah Williams, a venture capitalist who specialized in educational technology investments. These were serious people who took their responsibility seriously. They had agreed to serve on our board because they believed in our mission of supporting exceptional students who might not otherwise have access to advanced education. They had no idea that one of today's applicants was my sister. "Let's start with the doctoral fellowships," Dr. Harrison said, distributing copies of the top 12 applications. "We've got some really exceptional candidates this year." I opened my folder and stared down at Madison's smiling face in her application photo. She looked confident and optimistic, probably the same way I had looked 8 years ago when I had walked into my parents' kitchen with my own graduate school dreams. The difference was that Madison had grown up in a family that supported her ambitions. She had attended college without financial stress, graduated without debt, and spent the past 4 years working for an environmental advocacy group while preparing for law school. Her application essay mentioned briefly that she was fortunate to have family support for her undergraduate education, but hoped to fund graduate school independently to prove her commitment to her chosen field. Prove her commitment. As if taking on educational debt was somehow more noble than accepting family investment. As if students who couldn't afford to prove their commitment were somehow less deserving of educational opportunities. Application number 7 looks strong, Judge Chen was saying. Environmental law focus, solid academic record, clear research, interests. Application number 7. Madison's application. I agree, said Superintendent Rodriguez. The research proposal on climate litigation is particularly compelling. This is exactly the kind of work we want to support. I looked around the table at these accomplished people who had dedicated their careers to educational equity and social justice. They were evaluating Madison's application purely on its merits, just as they should, just as I had designed the process to ensure. But they didn't know that Madison Parker was the beneficiary of the same kind of arbitrary family favoritism that our scholarship program had been created to counteract. They didn't know that her debt-free undergraduate experience had given her advantages that most students could only dream of. They didn't know that approving her application would mean giving additional advantages to someone who had already been privileged by a family support system that operated according to unspoken biases about gender, age, and perceived potential. Dr. Thompson? Dr. Harrison was looking at me expectantly. What's your assessment of application number 7? I stared down at Madison's file, weighing 8 years of hurt and anger against 5 years of commitment to objective, merit-based selection processes. The person I had been before starting this foundation might have been tempted to reject Madison's application out of spite, but the person I had become understood that spite was just a no. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Other form of bias, no more justified than the favoritism that had shaped my own experience. On the other hand, approving Madison's application would mean using resources I had worked to create for someone who had already been the recipient of family investment. Someone who had chosen not to speak up when that investment was denied to her sister. Someone who was applying to my scholarship program without even bothering to learn who had created it or why. It's a strong application, I said carefully. The research focus aligns well with our priorities. Any concerns? Judge Chen asked. I paused, looking around the table at people who trusted my judgment and had supported the foundation's growth from the beginning. People who deserved honesty about potential conflicts of interest. Actually, yes, I said finally. I need to disclose something about this applicant before we make any decisions. The room grew quiet as I prepared to explain how Madison Parker's application had landed on our conference table, and why her request for educational funding was about to force me to confront 8 years of family history that I had tried to leave behind. But first, I needed to tell them about the Thursday evening in March 2015 when I had sat in my parents' kitchen, listening to them explain why my dreams weren't worth their investment, while my sister sat silently by, accepting their generosity without question. Because to understand why Madison Parker's fellowship application mattered, they needed to understand how the Henderson Foundation had really been born, not from some abstract commitment to educational equity, but from the specific experience of being told that my academic potential wasn't worth the financial risk, while watching my sister receive exactly the support I had been denied. The question now was whether that personal history should influence our decision about Madison's future, and whether the scholarship program I had created to level the playing field should be used to perpetuate the same kind of arbitrary favoritism that had shaped my own educational journey, just in reverse. The irony was almost too perfect. But as I looked around the conference table at people who had trusted me to make fair decisions about other people's educational opportunities, I realized that this moment would define not just Madison's future, but everything the Henderson Foundation claimed to represent. 8 years ago, My parents had made their choice about who deserved investment and who didn't. Now it was my turn to make the same kind of choice. The only question was what kind of person I wanted to be when the power dynamics were finally reversed. I need to take you back to understand how this all began, because some betrayals don't happen overnight. They build slowly, like pressure in a fault line, until one day the ground beneath your feet simply gives way. My name was Jennifer Parker then, and I had always been what people politely called the responsible one. While Madison was trying out for cheerleading and dating the quarterback, I was in the library researching college applications and scholarship opportunities. While she was switching majors twice during her first 2 years at Northwestern, I was graduating magna cum laude from Yale with a double major in sociology and public policy. I had a plan that stretched from undergraduate school through graduate work and into a career focused on educational research. The path was clear in my mind: doctoral program in educational policy, postdoc research position, tenure-track job at a major university, and eventually influencing policy that could improve educational outcomes for underserved communities. The Parker family lived in a comfortable colonial house on Elm Street in Westfield, New Jersey, complete with a front porch and the kind of manicured lawn that screamed middle-class stability. Dad worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, and Mom taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school until Madison started high school, when she transitioned to substitute teaching for more flexibility. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. Family vacations to the Outer Banks every summer, a newer Honda and Toyota in the driveway, and enough disposable income for Madison's dance lessons and my debate team travel expenses. The kind of family that could afford to send both daughters to good colleges if they planned carefully and made education a priority, which they did, apparently, for one of their daughters. Growing up, I had always assumed that academic achievement would translate into family support for my educational goals. I was the daughter who brought home straight A's, who won academic awards, who spent weekends working on science fair projects while Madison was at sleepovers. I was the one teachers pulled aside to suggest advanced placement courses and early college programs. Madison was different, not less intelligent, but less focused. She approached school the way she approached everything else, with enough effort to get by, but never the kind of intense dedication that characterized my own academic pursuits. She was more interested in social activities and extracurriculars that didn't require the same level of commitment as academic competition. Our parents seemed to accept these differences as natural variations in personality rather than indicators of long-term potential. Madison was the social one, the one who would probably find a nice husband and settle down close to home. I was the academic one, the one who would probably move away and have some kind of career they didn't fully understand. The first crack in my assumptions came during my senior year at Yale, when I started researching doctoral programs and calculating the costs involved. A PhD in educational policy would require 4 to 6 years of full-time study, with tuition costs ranging from $40,000 to $60,000 per year at top programs. Even with research assistantships and teaching positions, I would need significant financial support to avoid crushing debt. I spent months crafting applications to doctoral programs, but I also spent time researching funding options and creating detailed budgets for different scenarios. Unlike many of my classmates who seemed to assume their families would handle the financial aspects of continued education, I wanted to present my parents with a clear picture of what graduate school would require and how we might manage the costs together. The conversation I had been planning took place during Thanksgiving break of my senior year. Madison was home from Northwestern, full of stories about her new environmental studies major and her internship with a local conservation group. The family dinner table buzzed with her enthusiasm about sustainability and climate change, topics that seemed to engage our parents in ways my academic achievements never had. "I'm thinking about law school after graduation," Madison announced over dessert. "Environmental law is really taking off, and I think I could make a real difference." Working on climate litigation. Mom's face lit up with pride. That sounds wonderful, honey. What would that involve? 3 years of law school, but then I could work for organizations fighting corporate polluters or help develop environmental regulations. It's exactly the kind of work I'm passionate about, Dad nodded approvingly. Legal careers offer good financial stability, too. That's important when you're trying to make a difference in the world. I listened to this exchange with growing unease. Madison had discovered her passion for environmental issues roughly 6 months earlier, when she switched majors for the second time. But here she was discussing law school as if it had been her lifelong dream, and our parents were responding with the kind of enthusiasm I had never seen when I discussed my own academic plans. "What about you, Jen?" Mom asked, turning to me with what felt like obligatory interest. "Any thoughts about after graduation?" This was the opening I had been waiting for, but suddenly the conversation felt much more complicated than I had anticipated. Madison's casual mention of law school had been met with immediate support and excitement. Would my own plans receive the same reception? "Actually, I've been accepted to several doctoral programs in educational policy," I said, trying to match Madison's confident tone. "I'm most interested in the program at Columbia Teachers College, but I'm also considering Harvard and Stanford." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Dad set down his fork and looked at me with the kind of expression usually reserved for discussing car repairs or other expensive necessities. "Doctoral programs are quite long, aren't they?" he said finally. 4 to 6 years, depending on the dissertation research. "But the career opportunities afterward are really exciting. I could work in educational research, policy development, maybe eventually influence how we approach educational equity at the national level." Mom smiled the kind of smile that was supposed to be encouraging but felt patronizing instead. "That sounds very ambitious, dear. Have you looked into what kinds of jobs are actually available in that field?" The question caught me off guard. I had spent months researching career paths and employment prospects, but I hadn't expected to need to justify the practical value of my chosen field during what I thought would be a conversation about logistics and planning. Educational policy researchers work in universities, think tanks, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations, I explained. The starting salaries aren't huge, but there's definitely demand for people with strong research backgrounds and policy expertise. "What about the cost?" Dad asked, cutting straight to the heart of what I now realized was his primary concern. "Doctoral programs are expensive, and unlike medical or law school, there's no guarantee of high earning potential afterward." Here was my chance to present the careful financial analysis I had prepared. I pulled out the folder I had brought to dinner, filled with program comparisons, funding options, and projected costs. "I've researched this pretty thoroughly," I said, spreading papers across the table. "The total cost would be around $250,000 over 5 years, but that includes living expenses in expensive cities. There are research assistantships and teaching opportunities that would cover some of the costs, and I could potentially get fellowships for particularly strong candidates." I walked them through my calculations, explaining how different funding scenarios would work and what kind of family contribution would be needed in each case. In the best-case scenario, with full funding for the final 3 years, I would need about $75,000 in family support. In the worst case, if I couldn't secure major fellowships, the number could be as high as $150,000. "That's a substantial investment," Dad said, studying my projections with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for insurance policies and major purchases. "It is," I agreed, "but it's an investment in my ability to make a meaningful contribution to educational policy. The research I want to do could influence how we approach achievement gaps and educational equity for generations." Madison had been quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from her phone with apparent interest. "That sounds really cool, Jen. Like, you could actually help fix schools and stuff." Her support meant something. even if it was expressed in typically casual Madison fashion. But I noticed that our parents' expressions hadn't changed. They were still looking at my projections with the kind of skepticism usually reserved for timeshare presentations. "Have you considered other options?" Mom asked gently. "There are lots of ways to work in education without spending that much money on additional schooling. You could teach or work for educational nonprofits, or even go into educational consulting." The suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what I wanted to do with my life. Teaching was honorable work, but it wasn't research. Nonprofit work was meaningful, but it wasn't policy development. Consulting could be lucrative, but it wasn't the kind of systems-level change I wanted to pursue. "Those are all good options," I said carefully, "but they're not really the same as educational policy research. What I want to do requires the kind of specialized knowledge and credentials that only come from doctoral-level training." Dad leaned back in his chair, a gesture I recognized as his thinking pose. "Jen, we love your ambition, and we're proud of everything you've accomplished at Yale. But we need to be realistic about what our family can afford." The words hit differently than I had expected. I had come into this conversation assuming that the question was how we would manage the financial aspects of my graduate education, not whether we would manage them at all. "I'm not asking for the full amount all at once," I said quickly. "We could structure it over several years, and I'd be applying for every fellowship and assistantship available. I just need to know that there's family support as a backup." "It's not about the timeline," Mom said. "It's about the risk. Graduate school is expensive, and there's no guarantee that you'll find the kind of job you're hoping for afterward. We have to think about our own financial security, too. Their own financial security." I looked around the dining room where we were having this conversation, taking in the details I had grown up with but never really examined. The furniture was nice, but not extravagant. The artwork on the walls consisted of family photos and a few pieces Mom had picked up at local art fairs. Everything suggested comfort, but not luxury. But it also didn't suggest the kind of financial constraint that would make a $75,000 investment over 5 years impossible for a family with 2 professional incomes and a nearly paid-off mortgage. "What about Madison's law school?" I asked, immediately regretting the comparison but unable to stop myself from making it. "Law school is different," Dad said. "It's a 3-year program with clear career outcomes and earning potential. That's a much more straightforward investment. But law school is just as expensive as a doctoral program, and there's no guarantee Madison will get the kind of environmental law job she's talking about. Most lawyers end up doing corporate work that has nothing to do with their idealistic goals." I was arguing now, which had not been my intention, but the double standard was so obvious I couldn't ignore it. Madison's vague interest in environmental law was being treated as a solid career plan, while my years of academic preparation and clear research goals were being dismissed as impractical risk-taking. "That's enough," Mom said firmly. "We're not comparing your choices to Madison's choices. We're talking about what our family can realistically afford to support. But we were comparing choices, whether they wanted to admit it or not. And the comparison was revealing priorities and assumptions I had never fully recognized before." Madison was looking uncomfortable now, clearly sensing the tension, but probably not understanding its source. She had never needed to think about family financial priorities because she had never experienced them working against her interests. "Maybe we should talk about this another time," she suggested diplomatically, "when everyone's had time to think about all the options." "No," I said, more sharply than I intended. "I need to know where things stand so I can make decisions about my applications. The deadline for accepting graduate school offers is in April." Dad sighed, the kind of heavy exhalation that suggested this conversation was becoming more difficult than he had anticipated. "Jen, we're not saying no permanently. We're saying that we need time to consider what level of support we can realistically provide." Time to consider. It was a diplomatic way of saying that my educational goals were not an immediate priority. unlike Madison's plans, which had received instant enthusiasm and support. The rest of the conversation was awkward and inconclusive, with everyone trying to pretend that fundamental disagreements about my future could be resolved through further discussion and careful planning. But I left that Thanksgiving dinner with a clear understanding that my academic dreams were being evaluated according to criteria that had not been applied to Madison's plans. Over the next few months, as Madison received enthusiastic family support for her law school applications and I waited for clarity about graduate school funding, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Her LSAT prep course was paid for without question. Her law school application fees were covered as a matter of course. Her spring break trip to visit law schools was treated as a reasonable investment in her decision-making process. Meanwhile, my requests for clarity about doctoral program funding were met with continued delays and suggestions that I consider more practical alternatives. The foundation was cracking, slowly but inevitably. And by the time Madison received her acceptance letter to Northwestern's law school with a celebration dinner and a promise of full financial support, I finally understood that the crack had become a chasm. The responsible daughter who had earned straight A's and graduated magna cum laude from Yale was apparently not worth the same investment as the younger daughter who had switched majors twice and was pursuing a field she had discovered 6 months earlier. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying, because sitting in that same dining room where I had first presented my graduate school plans, watching Madison receive exactly the support I had been denied, I finally understood something important about family dynamics and educational opportunity. Sometimes, the people who claim to love you most are the ones who understand your worth the least. And sometimes the only way to prove that worth is to build something so undeniable that even they can't ignore it. I just didn't know yet that it would take 8 years and a scholarship foundation before I'd have the chance to test that theory. The final conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in March, exactly 4 months after that initial Thanksgiving discussion. Spring was beginning to show itself in Westfield, with daffodils pushing through the mulch in Mom's carefully tended flower beds, and the maple tree in our backyard starting to bud. It should have been a hopeful time, but I walked up the front steps of my childhood home carrying a weight of dread that had been building for weeks. I had called ahead to request a family meeting, explaining that I needed a final decision about graduate school funding so I could respond to Columbia's acceptance offer. The deadline was approaching, and I couldn't delay any longer without losing my spot in what was widely considered one of the best educational policy doctoral programs in the country. The past 4 months had been a careful dance of hope and disappointment. Every time I brought up graduate school, my parents found ways to defer the conversation. Dad needed to review their tax documents. Mom wanted to speak with their financial advisor. They were waiting to see what kind of aid packages I might receive from the universities themselves. Meanwhile, Madison's law school journey had progressed with remarkable smoothness. She had been accepted to Northwestern, Fordham, and George Washington University. The family had celebrated each acceptance letter like a personal victory, and discussions about her future had taken on an air of excitement and inevitability that stood in stark contrast to the anxiety surrounding my own plans. What made the disparity especially painful was that Madison's law school acceptances had come with minimal financial aid. Unlike doctoral programs, which sometimes offered full funding, for exceptional candidates, law schools typically expected students to pay their own way through loans or family support. Madison would need approximately $180,000 over 3 years, significantly more than the $75,000 I was requesting for my doctoral program. But somehow, Madison's more expensive and less funded education was being treated as a reasonable family investment, while my less expensive and potentially funded program was still under consideration. I had spent the previous week preparing for this conversation like it was a doctoral defense. Financial projections, alternative funding scenarios, detailed timelines for completion and career prospects. I had researched average salaries for educational policy researchers, employment rates for recent graduates from Columbia's program, and potential return on investment calculations that would make my education seem like sound financial planning rather than idealistic risk-taking. Looking back, I realized the absurdity of needing to justify the value of doctoral education to parents who had encouraged my academic pursuits for 22 years. But at the time, it felt like the only way to overcome whatever reservations were preventing them from supporting my goals. The living room had been rearranged since my last visit. Mom had moved the furniture to create a more conversational seating arrangement, with the couch and 2 armchairs forming a loose circle around the coffee table. It felt formal in a way that made me nervous, like a job interview rather than a family discussion. Madison was already there when I arrived, sitting cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open, apparently working on something law school related. She looked up when I walked in and smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Hey, Jen. Mom said you wanted to talk about graduate school stuff. How exciting that you're so close to making a decision." Her enthusiasm felt sincere, which somehow made the situation more complicated. Madison had never been intentionally cruel or competitive. Her acceptance of family advantages had always seemed unconscious rather than calculating. She genuinely appeared to believe that our parents approached both daughters' educational decisions with the same level of support and consideration. Mom bustled in from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee and homemade cookies, the same chocolate chip recipe she had been making since I was in elementary school. The domestic scene felt surreal, given the gravity of what I was about to discuss, like she was trying to soften difficult news with comfort food. "Where's Dad?" I asked, accepting a cup of coffee and trying to read the emotional temperature of the room. "He'll be right down," Mom said, settling into her favorite armchair. "He was just finishing up some work in his study." We made small talk while waiting, Madison updating us on her law school visits and her growing excitement about Northwestern's environmental law clinic. She described meeting with professors who were working on climate litigation and students who had gone on to work for the Environmental Protection Agency and major conservation organizations. "It feels like exactly the right fit," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I can totally see myself doing that kind of work, fighting for environmental justice and holding corporations accountable for their impact on climate change." Mom nodded approvingly. "It sounds like you've really found your calling, honey." Dad appeared in the doorway, looking tired in a way that immediately put me on edge. He had been working longer hours recently, traveling more frequently for his pharmaceutical sales job, and the stress was showing in the lines around his eyes and the slight slump of his shoulders. "Sorry to keep everyone waiting," he said, settling into the remaining armchair with a grunt of fatigue. "Long week." I had rehearsed my opening remarks, but sitting in that circle of family furniture, surrounded by people who had shaped my entire understanding of academic achievement and personal potential, the prepared words felt inadequate. "I wanted to talk about the Columbia acceptance," I began, trying to strike a balance between confidence and respect. "I need to respond to their offer by April 15th, and I can't make a decision without knowing what kind of family support is possible." Dad nodded slowly. "We've been giving this a lot of thought, Jen. Your mother and I have talked extensively about what we can realistically do." The word realistically immediately worried me. It suggested that my educational goals were being evaluated as financial burdens rather than family investments. "I appreciate that," I said, "and I want you to know that I've explored every possible alternative funding source. I've applied for external fellowships, research assistantships, even looked into programs that would let me work part-time while completing coursework. I spread my latest financial projections across the coffee table, documents that represented weeks of research and calculation. The numbers showed multiple scenarios, from best-case situations where I would need minimal family support to worst-case scenarios where I might need the full $75,000 I had originally requested. "These are very thorough," Mom said, picking up one of the spreadsheets and examining it with the kind of attention she usually reserved for her lesson plans. "You've clearly put a lot of work into this." "I have," I replied, "because I want to Make sure everyone understands exactly what we're talking about financially and practically. Dad leaned forward, studying the documents with an expression I couldn't quite read. The numbers are significant, even in the best-case scenario, and there's no guarantee you'll receive the kind of external funding you're hoping for. That's true, I admitted. But the same uncertainty applies to any educational investment. Madison's law school costs are essentially fixed, with very little opportunity for funding beyond what she's already been offered. I hadn't meant to bring Madison into the conversation so directly, but the comparison seemed relevant to any discussion of family educational priorities. Law school is different, Dad said, echoing the same distinction he had made during our Thanksgiving conversation. The career outcomes are more predictable, and the earning potential is clearer. But my doctoral program is actually less expensive than Madison's law school, I pointed out. And educational policy research offers plenty of career stability, university positions, government work, think tank research. There are lots of options for people with these credentials. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken considerations. Madison looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing that she had become part of a comparison she hadn't sought. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation's worth of meaning. "Jen," Mom said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to be honest with you about our financial situation." My heart sank. Here it came. The explanation about why my education was financially impossible while Madison's was somehow manageable. "We've looked at our savings, our projected retirement needs, and the costs of supporting both you and Madison through graduate school," Dad continued. "We simply can't afford to fund 2 expensive graduate programs simultaneously. 2 expensive graduate programs." The phrasing revealed everything about how this decision had been framed in their minds. They weren't choosing whether to support my education. They were choosing which daughter's education to support. "So you're saying I need to wait until Madison finishes law school?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was more definitive than that. "We're saying that we've decided to focus our educational investment on Madison's law degree," Mom said, the words coming out in a rush as if speed might somehow soften their impact. The room went silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that had provided background rhythm to countless family conversations over the years. But this conversation felt different from all the others, marked by a finality that made the familiar seem suddenly foreign. "You've decided," I repeated slowly, making sure I understood what was being said. "You've already made the choice." "We have," Dad confirmed. "We think Madison's law degree represents the better investment for our family resources." The clinical language was almost worse than outright rejection. Better investment, family resources, as if my academic potential was being evaluated according to the same criteria they might use to choose between mutual funds or insurance policies. "Can I ask why?" I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded despite the devastation spreading through my chest. "What makes Madison's law degree a better investment than my doctoral program?" The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they hadn't expected to need to articulate their reasoning beyond the simple declaration of their decision. "Well," Mom began uncertainly, "law is a more established profession. There are clear career paths and earning potential. Educational policy research is also an established field," I replied. "Columbia's program has a 95% job. Placement rate for graduates and starting salaries are competitive with other social science PhDs. But law school is only 3 years," Dad added. "Your program could take 5 or 6 years, which means more total cost and more time before you're earning a full income." I wanted to point out that Madison had no guarantee of finding the kind of environmental law position she was describing, that most law school graduates ended up in corporate firms doing work that had nothing to do with their idealistic goals. I wanted to mention that doctoral programs often came with research assistantships and teaching opportunities that provided both income and professional experience. But sitting in that living room, watching my parents defend a decision they had, clearly already made, I realized that facts and logic weren't really driving their choice. This was about something deeper than financial analysis or career prospects. "Is this because you think Madison is more likely to succeed than I am?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke, making visible something that had been present but unacknowledged throughout the conversation. "It's not about success," Mom said quickly. "We believe in both of your abilities." "Then what is it about?" Another heavy silence. Madison was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. I felt sorry for her, caught in a comparison she had never asked to be part of, but I also felt angry that she wasn't speaking up to question the fairness of what was happening. "It's about practicality," Dad said finally. "Madison's career goals are more accessible. Environmental law is a growing field with clear client needs and revenue potential. Educational research is more dependent on government funding and academic institutions that have uncertain futures. Accessible. The word revealed so much about their assumptions. Madison's goals were accessible because they were familiar, conventional, the kind of career path that made sense to parents who had lived their entire lives within traditional professional frameworks. My goals were inaccessible because they involved a level of academic specialization that they couldn't fully understand or evaluate. Educational policy research wasn't the kind of work that got discussed at neighborhood barbecues or family gatherings. It was abstract, intellectual, removed from the concrete professional success they could recognize and celebrate. "I see," I said, and I did see, perhaps more clearly than I wanted to. This wasn't really about money or practicality or investment potential. This was about their comfort level with different types of ambition. Madison wanted to be a lawyer, a profession they understood and respected. I wanted to be an educational researcher, a profession that seemed foreign and unnecessarily complicated. Madison wanted to fight climate change through litigation, a goal that sounded concrete and heroic. I wanted to influence educational policy through research and analysis, a goal that sounded academic and theoretical. Madison's path led to a career they could explain to their friends and neighbors. My path led to a career they would struggle to describe or defend. "So the decision is final?" I asked. "It is," Dad confirmed. "We've committed to supporting Madison through law school, and we don't have the resources to fund your doctoral program as well." Committed. Past tense. They had already made promises to Madison that precluded supporting my education. The decision had been made without consulting me, without considering alternatives that might have supported both daughters' goals. "When did you make this commitment?" I asked. Another uncomfortable silence. "We discussed it with Madison earlier this week," Mom admitted. "We wanted to let her know she could count on our support for Northwestern." Earlier this week, while I had been preparing financial projections and researching alternative funding sources, they had already been assuring Madison that her education was secured. The conversation I had requested wasn't actually a decision-making meeting. It was a notification of a decision that had already been made. The betrayal was complete, but it was also illuminating. I finally understood that this had never been about choosing between two equally valued options. This had been about finding ways to justify a choice they had already made based on preferences and assumptions they couldn't openly acknowledge. Madison looked up from her hands, her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or guilt. "Jen, I'm really sorry. I didn't know they hadn't talked to you yet about their decision." Her apology was sincere, but it also revealed that she had accepted their commitment without questioning whether it was fair to make such a decision without including me in the conversation. She had been perfectly willing to receive their support, without ensuring that I had been given equal consideration. "It's not your fault," I said, and meant it. Madison had simply accepted advantages that were offered to her, just as she had been accepting them our entire lives. The fault lay with parents who had created and perpetuated a system of unequal investment in their daughter's potential. "Is there anything else you want to discuss?" Dad asked, clearly eager to conclude what had become an uncomfortable conversation. I looked around the living room where I had grown up, taking in details that would never look the same to me again. The family photos on the mantel showing two daughters at various stages of childhood success. The diplomas on the wall represent Mom's education degree and Dad's business school graduation. The comfortable furniture that represented financial stability and middle-class aspirations. Everything in that room spoke of a family that valued education and achievement, that had the means to support their children's academic goals, that should have been celebrating the opportunity to send both daughters to prestigious graduate programs. But, sitting in that circle of furniture, having just been told that my academic dreams were worth less than my sister's, I realized that the family I thought I knew had never really existed. The parents I thought had raised me to believe in the value of education and hard work had actually raised me to believe that some people's education and hard work mattered more than others. No, I said finally. I think I understand everything. I need to understand. I gathered my financial projections and funding scenarios, documents that had become suddenly irrelevant. As I folded them back into my folder, I caught Madison watching me with an expression of genuine concern. "What will you do?" she asked softly. It was a good question. What would I do? How did someone respond to discovering that their family's love came with conditions they had never understood? How did someone build a future when the people who were supposed to believe in them most had just announced that they didn't? "I'll figure something out," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I always do." Walking to my car, I felt strangely detached from the magnitude of what had just happened. The emotional devastation would come later, but in that moment, I felt mostly clarity. Clarity about who my parents really were, about what their support had always been contingent upon, about what I would need to do if I wanted to pursue my actual goals rather than the more acceptable alternatives they preferred. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, looking back at the house where I had learned about family loyalty and educational achievement and personal potential. The lessons I had learned there were more complicated than I had realized, but they were also more valuable than my parents probably intended. Because sitting in that driveway, having just been told that my dreams weren't worth their investment, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I was going to prove them wrong. Not through arguments or demonstrations, but through success so undeniable that even they couldn't dismiss it. I was going to fund my own doctoral program, build my own career, and create my own opportunities. And someday, when I had the power to make decisions about other people's educational futures, I was going to remember this conversation and everything it had taught me about fairness, potential, and the way families choose which dreams to support. Just had no idea that it would take 8 years before I'd have the chance to test whether I had learned the right lessons. The first 3 months after that devastating family meeting were the hardest of my life. I moved back to New Haven temporarily, subletting a studio apartment near Yale while I figured out what came next. The space was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate, mini fridge, and microwave, balanced on a card table. It was a far cry from the comfortable bedroom I had grown up in, or even the spacious dorm room I had enjoyed as a Yale undergraduate. But it was mine, paid for with money I had earned from work-study jobs and summer internships, and that independence felt important even when everything else in my life felt uncertain. The immediate problem was Columbia's deadline. I had 2 weeks to either accept their doctoral program offer with some form of funding plan or decline and wait another year to reapply everywhere. Declining felt like giving up on my dreams entirely, but accepting meant committing to a financial path I hadn't fully figured out yet. I spent those 2 weeks researching every possible funding option. Federal student loans would cover some of the costs, but not nearly enough to live in New York City while attending school full-time. Private loans were available but came with interest rates that would saddle me with crushing debt for decades. Work-study programs existed, but most required American citizenship that I would need to maintain while completing coursework and dissertation research. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, my undergraduate thesis advisor, had been following my graduate school applications and was surprised when I didn't immediately accept Columbia's offer. When I explained my funding situation, she listened with the kind of focused attention that had made her such an effective mentor throughout my undergraduate years. "Jennifer," she said during our coffee meeting at a cafe near campus, "you're approaching this like you need to solve the entire financial puzzle before you can begin. But doctoral programs aren't like law school or medical school. There are opportunities to earn funding once you're already in the program, if you're willing to be creative and work harder than your peers." Dr. Chen had completed her own PhD at Harvard 20 years earlier, as a first-generation college student whose family had no understanding of graduate education. Her path to funding had involved research assistantships, teaching positions, summer internships, and eventually a dissertation fellowship that covered her final 2 years. "The key," she explained, "is to get into the program first, prove your value quickly, and then position yourself for the best funding opportunities as they become available. Faculty want to invest in students who demonstrate real potential, but they need to see that potential in action." She offered to make some calls on my behalf, reaching out to colleagues at Columbia who might be able to provide more information about funding opportunities that weren't widely advertised. Within a week, she had connected me with Dr. Elizabeth Rodriguez, a professor in Columbia's educational policy program, who was looking for a research assistant for a major study on charter school effectiveness. The research assistantship wouldn't cover all my expenses, but it would provide $25,000 per year plus tuition remission for up to 3 years. Combined with federal loans and a part-time weekend job, it would be enough to make the program financially viable, if barely. I accepted Columbia's offer on the last possible day, signing the paperwork with a mixture of excitement and terror that would characterize most of my graduate school experience. Moving to New York City in August felt like stepping into a completely different world. I found a shared apartment in Washington Heights, splitting a 2-bedroom with 3 other graduate students in a building that had seen better decades. My portion of the rent was $800 per month for a converted living room, with no windows and paper-thin walls that made privacy impossible. The other roommates were all PhD students in various stages of their programs. Sarah was finishing her dissertation in comparative literature, surviving on a diet of instant ramen and library coffee while trying to complete her research on post-colonial narratives. Marcus was in his 3rd year of a sociology program, working 3 part-time jobs to supplement his teaching assistantship. Priya was starting her 2nd year in psychology, having just learned that her funding package was smaller than originally promised. Living with other graduate students who understood the financial pressures and academic demands made the transition easier, but it also highlighted just how different my situation was from most of my undergraduate peers. While Madison was settling into her fully funded law school experience at Northwestern, I was learning to budget $50 per week for groceries and calculating whether I could afford subway fare or needed to walk the 40 blocks from Columbia to my weekend job at a test prep company in Midtown. The academic work was demanding but exhilarating. Rodriguez's research project involved analyzing achievement data from over 200 charter schools across 5 states, looking for patterns that might explain why some schools succeeded in closing achievement gaps while others failed to improve outcomes for low-income students. The work was exactly the kind of policy-relevant research I had dreamed of conducting, and Dr. Rodriguez was the kind of mentor who pushed her students to think more rigorously while also providing the support they needed to succeed. But the financial stress was constant and exhausting. Every decision became a calculation about cost versus benefit. Could I afford to buy the recommended textbook for my quantitative methods class, or should I try to find a used copy at the library? Was it worth spending money on coffee with classmates who might become important professional connections, or should I stick to free water and save the $4 for groceries? The isolation was almost as difficult as the financial pressure. Most of my classmates came from families that understood and supported graduate education. They worried about comprehensive exams and dissertation topics, but not about whether they could afford to eat dinner or whether their part-time jobs would interfere with their coursework. I found myself avoiding social gatherings that involved spending money, which meant missing opportunities to build relationships with peers who might become lifelong colleagues. I skipped conferences that could have advanced my research because I couldn't afford the travel costs. I turned down research opportunities that didn't come with funding, even when they might have led to valuable connections or publications. The worst moments came when I had to decline opportunities that felt directly relevant to my career goals. During my first semester, Dr. Rodriguez mentioned a summer research fellowship with the Department of Education that would provide incredible experience in federal policy development. The fellowship was unpaid, designed for students whose families could support them during the summer while they gained valuable experience. "You should definitely apply," Dr. Rodriguez said after describing the opportunity. "The connections you'd make would be invaluable for your career." I nodded and said I would consider it, but we both knew I couldn't afford to work without pay for 3 months, no matter how valuable the experience might be. While other students prepared applications for prestigious unpaid internships, I spent the summer working double shifts at the test prep company and picking up additional research assistant hours wherever I could find them. The contrast with Madison's experience was painful to contemplate. Her law school updates, shared through family group texts and holiday phone calls, described externships with environmental law firms, networking events with practicing attorneys, and summer internships that paid competitive salaries while providing exactly the kind of professional experience she needed for her career goals. She never explicitly mentioned the family funding that made these opportunities possible, but the casual way she discussed expensive law school activities made it clear that financial constraints weren't shaping her educational experience the way they were shaping mine. The breaking point came during my second year, when I had to choose between attending my first academic conference and paying for winter heat in our apartment. The conference was the annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association, the most important gathering for people in my field. Dr. Rodriguez had accepted my paper proposal for presentation, which was a significant honor for a second-year graduate student. But the conference was in San Francisco, and between travel costs, hotel expenses, and registration fees, attending would cost nearly $1,500 I didn't have. My roommates and I had already been keeping the apartment heat at 62 degrees to manage utility costs, and winter in New York was proving more expensive than any of us had anticipated. I spent a week agonizing over the decision before finally concluding that basic survival had to take priority over career advancement. I withdrew my paper presentation and watched from New York as my peers posted photos from the conference, presenting their research and making connections that would benefit their careers for years to come. That night, sitting in my freezing apartment, wearing 3 layers of clothing while trying to write a seminar paper, I allowed myself to imagine what my life might have looked like with family support. I pictured presenting my research to a room full of educational policy experts, engaging in the kind of intellectual discussions that had originally attracted me to academic work, building relationships with scholars whose work I had been reading for years. Instead, I was worried about whether I could afford to replace my laptop if it died, whether my weekend job would provide enough hours to cover rent, and whether I was falling too far behind my peers to ever catch up professionally. But something shifted that night in the cold apartment with my breath visible in the air. Instead of feeling defeated by the constraints I was operating under, I started feeling angry about them. Angry that financial circumstances were limiting my academic potential. Angry that family support was distributed so arbitrarily. Angry that educational opportunity was still so dependent on economic privilege, even in graduate programs that claimed to select students based on merit alone. The anger was energizing in a way that self-pity had never been. Instead of accepting that I would always be at a disadvantage compared to better-funded peers, I started looking for ways to level the playing field through superior preparation and harder work. I began spending extra hours in the library, reading more comprehensively than my coursework required. I volunteered for additional research projects, even when they didn't come with additional pay, because the experience and connections might prove valuable later. I started writing more papers for submission to academic journals, reasoning that publications would matter more than conference presentations in the long run. Most importantly, I started paying attention to the structural factors that created the financial barriers I was experiencing. The unpaid internships that excluded students who couldn't afford to work without compensation. The conference travel costs that prevented low-income students from networking and presenting their research. The expectation that graduate students would supplement their funding through family support that wasn't available to everyone. These observations became the foundation for a research project that would eventually shape my dissertation and my career. I started documenting the ways that financial inequality affected graduate student experiences and academic outcomes, building a database of policies and practices that created systematic advantages for students from wealthy families. The research was personally motivated, but it was also academically rigorous. I interviewed dozens of graduate students about their funding sources and the impact of financial stress on their academic progress. I analyzed institutional policies around funding, allocation, and opportunity distribution. I tracked career outcomes for students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. What I found was both validating and disturbing. Students with family financial support were significantly more likely to attend conferences, accept unpaid research opportunities, and complete their degrees without excessive debt. They were also more likely to receive additional funding opportunities, partly because they could afford to take risks that led to better outcomes. The data confirmed what I had experienced personally, that graduate education, despite its meritocratic ideals, was still heavily influenced by family economic resources. Students who couldn't afford to take unpaid opportunities were systematically excluded from experiences that advanced their careers. Students who worked multiple jobs to support themselves had less time for the research and networking activities. That led to academic success. By my third year, this research had evolved into my dissertation topic, Family Capital and Graduate Student Success: How Socioeconomic Background Shapes Educational Outcomes in Doctoral Programs. The work was getting attention from faculty and policy researchers who recognized its implications for graduate school reform and educational equity. Dr. Rodriguez encouraged me to present preliminary findings at the following year's ERA conference, and this time I was determined to find a way to attend. I applied for every travel grant available, took on additional research assistant hours, and even started a small tutoring business to earn extra money for conference expenses. The presentation went better than I had hoped. The session was well attended, with audience members asking thoughtful questions about policy implications and methodology. Several established researchers approached me afterward to discuss collaboration opportunities and potential publications. But the most meaningful moment came when a first-year graduate student from Ohio State approached me after the presentation. She was the first person in her family to attend college, working multiple jobs to fund her doctoral program in educational psychology, and feeling increasingly isolated from peers who seemed to navigate graduate school with much greater ease. "Your research made me feel less alone," she said quietly. "I've been wondering if I was the only one struggling with these issues, or if there was something wrong with me for finding graduate school so financially difficult." Her words crystallized something I had been feeling throughout my own graduate school experience. The financial barriers I had encountered weren't personal failings or individual problems. They were systematic issues that affected many students, but were rarely discussed openly in academic settings. That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually become the Henderson Foundation. But first, I had to finish my degree, find stable employment, and build the credibility and resources necessary to create meaningful change in how educational opportunities were distributed. The final 2 years of my doctoral program were still challenging, but they felt different because I had found a sense of purpose that went beyond my own academic goals. I was documenting problems that affected thousands of students, and I was beginning to envision solutions that could make graduate education more accessible to people from diverse economic backgrounds. When I successfully defended my dissertation in May of my 6th year, the moment felt like validation, not just of my research, but of every sacrifice I had made to reach that point. Dr. Rodriguez introduced me at the defense as one of the most determined and insightful students she had worked with, someone who had turned personal challenges into academic insights that would benefit the entire field. Sitting in that conference room, surrounded by faculty members who had become mentors and advocates, I thought about the family meeting 6 years earlier when my parents had explained why my educational goals weren't worth their investment. They had been wrong about my potential, wrong about my determination, and wrong about the value of the work I wanted to do. But their rejection had also forced me to develop resources and perspectives I might never have gained if my path had been easier. I had proven I could succeed without their support. Now I was ready to help other students do the same thing. The job offer from the Chicago Institute for Educational Policy Research came 3 weeks after my dissertation defense, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other in my shared apartment, in Washington Heights. I was preparing instant coffee and reviewing job application materials when my phone rang with a Chicago area code I didn't recognize. Dr. Parker? The voice belonged to Dr. Michael Harrison, the Institute's director, whom I had met briefly at the previous year's ERA conference. I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to discuss a research position that might interest you. The position he described was everything I had hoped for in my first postdoctoral job. The Chicago Institute was a prestigious think tank that influenced federal education policy through rigorous research and strategic advocacy. They needed someone to lead a 3-year study on graduate student financing and educational equity, directly building on the dissertation research that had attracted attention throughout the academic community. Your work on family capital and graduate student success has created quite a stir in policy circles, Dr. Harrison explained. The Department of Education is funding a major initiative on graduate school accessibility, and your research provides exactly the framework they're looking for. The salary was $85,000 per year, more money than I had ever imagined earning, especially compared to the $25,000 research assistantship that had sustained me through graduate school. But more important than the financial security was the opportunity to transform my academic research into actual policy recommendations that could affect thousands of students. I accepted the position immediately, probably with less negotiation than a more experienced researcher would have attempted. But after 6 years of financial uncertainty and academic isolation, the chance to do meaningful work while earning a living wage felt like winning the lottery. Moving to Chicago that summer was a revelation. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I could afford to live alone in a decent apartment. I found a 1-bedroom place in Lincoln Park, walking distance from the Institute's offices, with hardwood floors and windows that actually opened. The rent was $200 per month, which seemed extravagant after years of shared living spaces, but represented less than 20% of my new salary. The luxury of having my own space, my own kitchen, my own quiet office area where I could work, without interruption, felt almost surreal. I spent the first week just enjoying the silence, the ability to control my environment, the simple pleasure of eating meals I had prepared in my own kitchen using ingredients I could afford to buy. But the real transformation was professional. The Chicago Institute provided resources I had never experienced during graduate school. Access to comprehensive databases, funding for conference travel, research assistance to help with data collection and analysis, and most importantly, direct connections to policymakers who were interested in implementing research-based solutions. My first major project involved expanding the graduate student financing research to include a national sample of doctoral programs across multiple disciplines. The Institute's reputation opened doors that would have remained closed to a recent PhD working independently. University administrators who might have ignored requests from an unknown researcher responded immediately to inquiries from the Chicago Institute. Within 6 months, I had collected data from over 50 doctoral programs and interviewed more than 300 graduate students about their financing strategies and educational experiences. The patterns I had identified in my dissertation research proved to be even more widespread than I had originally documented. Students from wealthy families were not only more likely to complete their degrees without debt, but also more likely to receive prestigious fellowships, attend elite conferences, and secure tenure-track positions after graduation. The advantages compounded over time, creating systematic inequalities that persisted throughout academic careers. The research attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The New York Times education reporter reached out for an interview after seeing my presentation at a Washington policy conference. The resulting article, titled "The Hidden Class Divide in Graduate School," was published on the front page of the Sunday Education section and generated hundreds of responses from graduate students sharing their own experiences with educational. Financing.National Public Radio invited me to discuss the research on their education podcast, reaching an audience of thousands of listeners who included current students, university administrators, and policymakers. Congressional staff members began citing my work in briefings about federal student aid reform. The recognition was gratifying, but it was also overwhelming. I had spent years feeling invisible in academic settings, struggling to afford basic participation in professional activities. Suddenly, people were seeking my expertise and treating my research as essential reading for anyone interested in educational equity. The shift in my professional status became obvious during my second year at the Institute, when I was invited to keynote the annual conference of the National Association of Graduate Schools. The same organization that had seemed impossibly elite during my own graduate student struggles was now asking me to address an audience of deans and administrators about systemic barriers to doctoral education. Standing at the podium in the grandee ballroom of a Chicago hotel, looking out at an audience of several hundred people who controlled graduate programs across the country, I felt the full weight of how far I had traveled from that freezing apartment in Washington Heights. My presentation focused on concrete policy recommendations derived from the research: need-based travel grants for conference attendance, paid research opportunities instead of unpaid internships, transparent funding allocation processes, and institutional support for students from low-income backgrounds. The response was enthusiastic and immediate. During the question and answer session, administrators from major universities described initiatives they were planning to implement based on my recommendations. The association's executive director approached me afterward to discuss a consulting contract for developing best practices guidelines. But the most meaningful moment came when a graduate dean from Northwestern University introduced herself during the reception following my presentation. We discussed her institution's efforts to improve graduate student support, and she mentioned casually that they were particularly focused on their law school's pro bono clinic program. Northwestern's law school, I repeated, trying to keep my voice neutral. I actually have a personal connection there. My sister graduated from their environmental law program a few years ago. Madison Parker, the dean said immediately. Of course. She was one of our standout students, very involved in the environmental law clinic. She's doing excellent work with the Sierra Club now, I believe. Madison's post-graduation success wasn't news to me. Family group texts had kept me updated on her career progression: a prestigious clerkship with a federal judge, followed by her current position as a staff attorney with the Sierra Club's climate litigation team. Everything had unfolded exactly as my parents had predicted when they chose to invest in her education rather than mine. She's very talented, I agreed diplomatically, not mentioning that her smooth career trajectory had been built on a foundation of family financial support that had been denied to her sister. The conversation was a reminder that even as my own career flourished, the fundamental inequity of my family's educational investments remained unchanged. Madison's success validated their decision to support her law degree, while my success was viewed as independent achievement that bore no relationship to their earlier choice to withhold support. That disconnect became more apparent during my third year at the Institute, when my research began receiving national recognition from major foundations and policy organizations. The Spencer Foundation awarded me a $200,000 grant to expand the graduate student financing study to include international comparisons. The Carnegie Corporation invited me to join a commission on the future of doctoral education. Most significantly, the MacArthur Foundation selected me as one of 30 researchers to participate in their new initiative on educational equity, providing $100,000 in flexible funding for innovative policy research. The MacArthur selection came with significant prestige and media attention, including profiles in academic journals and education publications. I had become exactly the kind of expert my parents had claimed was unlikely to emerge from doctoral education in educational policy. My research was influencing federal legislation, my recommendations were being implemented by major universities, and my expertise was sought by policymakers and foundation leaders across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me that the career path they had dismissed as impractical and financially risky was now providing both professional recognition and financial security that exceeded what many lawyers achieved, including lawyers working in environmental advocacy. But my growing prominence in educational policy circles also created unexpected complications with my family relationships. The occasional news coverage and professional achievements that I had initially hoped might vindicate my educational choices began to feel like sources of tension rather than opportunities for reconciliation. During a rare phone conversation with my mother, she mentioned having seen my name in an article about graduate school reform that one of her teaching colleagues had shared. "It's wonderful that your work is getting attention," she said carefully. "Though I have to admit, we don't always understand exactly what you do." The comment revealed how little my family knew about my professional life, despite the public recognition my research had received. They remained fundamentally uncomfortable with work that didn't fit their conventional understanding of career success. "I study how family financial support affects graduate school outcomes," I explained, perhaps more directly than I had ever described my research to them before. "I document how students from wealthy families have systematic advantages over students who have to fund their own education." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us wanted to address explicitly. "That sounds very academic," my mother said finally, her tone suggesting that academic work remained in her mind, somehow removed from practical reality. The conversation ended politely but awkwardly, with both of us aware that my research success was simultaneously validating my educational choices and highlighting the problematic nature of their earlier decision to withhold support. Similar tensions emerged during the rare family gatherings I attended. Madison's legal work was easily understood and celebrated by relatives who could relate to environmental protection and corporate accountability. My policy research was more difficult to explain and generated the kind of polite interest usually reserved for discussing other people's hobbies. The contrast was particularly stark during my cousin's wedding reception, when I found myself sitting at a table with several relatives who were curious about both Madison's and my career progress. "Madison is doing such important work with the Sierra Club," my aunt commented. "Fighting those big companies that are destroying the environment. It's exactly the kind of work our family can be proud of." "What about Jennifer?" my uncle asked, turning to me with well-meaning curiosity. "What kind of research are you doing these days?" I attempted to explain the graduate student financing project and its policy implications, but I could see their attention drifting as I described statistical analysis and federal funding mechanisms. The work that was reshaping how universities approached graduate education seemed abstract and irrelevant to people whose understanding of professional success was based on more conventional measures. "That's very interesting," my aunt said with the kind of polite smile usually reserved for small children explaining their artwork. "It's so nice that you found something you enjoy doing, something I enjoyed doing." As if research that influenced federal policy and affected thousands of students was a personal hobby rather than substantive professional work. These family interactions were frustrating, but they were also clarifying. They helped me understand that external recognition and professional success wouldn't necessarily change my family's perception of my choices or create the validation I had unconsciously been seeking. More importantly, they reinforced my growing conviction that the inequities I had experienced personally were part of much larger systemic problems that required institutional solutions rather than individual vindication. That realization was crystallizing into something more ambitious than research and policy recommendations. During my 4th year at the Institute, I began exploring the possibility of creating a foundation that could directly address the financing barriers I had been documenting. The idea started as conversations with colleagues about the limitations of policy research. We could document problems and recommend solutions, but implementing those solutions required resources and institutional commitment that often took years to materialize. What if we created an organization that could provide immediate support to students facing these barriers? I suggested during a team meeting about the Graduate Student Financing Project, something that could offer funding while also advocating for systemic change. Dr. Harrison was intrigued by the concept. You're talking about something like a private foundation focused specifically on graduate student support? Exactly, but designed based on research about what actually works, rather than traditional approaches that often replicate the same inequities they claim to address. The conversation that began that afternoon would eventually evolve into the Henderson Foundation, Educational Excellence Program. But first, I needed to build the connections, credibility, and resources necessary to make such an ambitious vision reality. By the end of my 4th year at the Institute, I had established myself as a leading expert on graduate school financing and educational equity. My research was cited in congressional hearings, implemented by major universities, and recognized by foundation leaders across the country. But more importantly, I had developed a clear vision for how research could be translated into direct action to support students facing the same barriers I had encountered during my own educational journey. The recognition was satisfying, but it was also a foundation for something larger, something that would allow me to move beyond documenting problems to actually solving them, one student at a time. The board meeting resumed after my disclosure about Madison's identity, and the atmosphere in the conference room had shifted dramatically. Judge Chen removed her reading glasses and set them on the table with deliberate precision, while Superintendent Rodriguez leaned back in his chair with an expression of careful consideration. Dr. Harrison looked genuinely surprised, though not entirely shocked. The academic world was smaller than most people realized, and family connections occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. "This is obviously a significant conflict of interest," Sarah Williams said, breaking the silence with her characteristic directness. As a venture capitalist, she was accustomed to navigating complex ethical situations and understood the importance of addressing potential problems head-on. "It is," I agreed, which is why I felt obligated to disclose it before we made any decisions about her application. Judge Chen spoke next, her judicial experience evident in her methodical approach to the situation. "Can you give us some context about your relationship with your sister? Is this an estrangement situation, or are you in regular contact?" The question was more complicated than it appeared. Madison and I weren't estranged in any dramatic sense. We exchanged holiday greetings and attended the same family gatherings when geography permitted. But we also weren't close, and we had never directly addressed the educational funding disparity that had shaped both our paths through graduate school. "We're in occasional contact," I explained carefully. "But we've never discussed the circumstances. That led me to change my name or pursue my career independently. As far as I know, she has no idea that I founded this organization or that Dr. Rebecca Thompson is her sister Jennifer Parker." Superintendent Rodriguez frowned slightly. She applied to your scholarship foundation without researching who runs it, apparently. The application shows no recognition of any personal connection, and she lists her undergraduate funding source as family support, without any indication that she's aware of the contrast with my own educational financing. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What kind of contrast are we talking about specifically? This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating for 8 years. The chance to tell the complete story to people who understood educational equity and family dynamics, who would grasp the full implications of what had happened and what it meant for Madison's current application. 8 years ago, our parents refused to provide financial support for my doctoral program because they considered it too risky and impractical, I began, watching their faces carefully. 3 months later, they provided $60,000 per year for Madison's law school education, describing it as a better investment with clearer career prospects. The room was absolutely silent. These were people who had dedicated their careers to educational equity and understood intimately how family financial support affected student outcomes. They knew exactly what kind of advantages Madison had received and what kind of barriers I had faced. Your sister received full family funding for law school while you were denied support for your doctoral program? Judge Chen asked, her tone carefully neutral but her expression revealing the significance she placed on this information. That's correct. I completed my PhD through research assistantships, loans, and part-time work, while she graduated from law school debt-free with the ability to pursue unpaid internships and networking opportunities that weren't available to students who needed to earn income. Sarah Williams was taking notes, her business background evident in her systematic approach to analyzing the situation. So Madison Parker has already benefited from the kind of family educational investment that most of our scholarship recipients lack entirely. Yes. And she's now applying for additional educational funding for law school, apparently without recognizing the irony of seeking support from an organization founded by the sister whose education her family chose not to fund. The implications were sinking in around the table. The Henderson Foundation had been created specifically to support students who lacked family financial support for graduate education. Our mission statement explicitly focused on leveling the playing field for students from lower-income backgrounds or families that couldn't afford to fund advanced degrees. Madison didn't fit that profile. She had already received substantial family investment for her undergraduate and law school education. Her application for doctoral fellowship funding represented a request for additional advantages on top of the privileges she had already enjoyed. This puts us in an extremely difficult position, Dr. Harrison said finally. On one hand, Madison Parker appears to be a qualified candidate based on academic merit alone. On the other hand, awarding her our fellowship would mean providing additional resources to someone who has already received significant family educational investment. Judge Chen nodded slowly. It would also mean that Rebecca, Jennifer, would be in the position of funding her sister's continued education after being denied family support for her own. The personal dimensions of the situation were impossible to ignore, but they weren't necessarily the most important considerations. The Henderson Foundation had been built on principles that went beyond individual family dynamics, and our decisions needed to reflect those principles rather than personal grievances or vindictive impulses. Let me ask a different question. Superintendent Rodriguez said, his experience in educational administration evident in his pragmatic approach. Setting aside the family history, does Madison Parker's application represent the kind of candidate we want to support with our limited resources? It was exactly the right question, forcing us to separate the objective evaluation criteria from the emotional complications of personal relationships. Her academic credentials are strong, I admitted. Law degree from Northwestern, solid grades, good recommendations. Her research proposal on climate litigation is well developed and addresses important environmental justice issues. But? Sarah Williams prompted, sensing the hesitation in my response. But she's also applying for funding to pursue a JD-PhD dual degree, which means she's already completed law school and is now seeking support for additional credentials. Most of our fellowship recipients are pursuing their first graduate degree, and wouldn't have had access to the kind of comprehensive legal education she's already received. Dr. Harrison was reviewing Madison's application materials as I spoke. Her personal statement mentions using the fellowship to expand her expertise beyond legal advocacy into policy research, which suggests this is supplementary education, rather than essential career preparation. The distinction was important. The Henderson Foundation prioritized students for whom our support would make the difference between pursuing graduate education and being excluded from it entirely. Madison was seeking funding for additional credentials that would enhance her already established legal career, not enable her to access graduate education for the first time. There's another factor to consider, Judge Chen added. Madison's application lists her expected debt load from the JD PhD program as minimal due to previous financial planning. That language suggests she has access to other funding sources that most of our applicants lack. I hadn't noticed that detail in my initial review of her application, but Judge Chen was right. Madison's confident assumption that she could manage additional educational costs without significant debt indicated a level of financial security that contradicted the fellowship's focus on supporting students who couldn't afford graduate school without assistance. So, we have an applicant who has already received family funding for law school, who has other resources available for continued education, and who is seeking fellowship support for supplementary credentials rather than essential career preparation, Superintendent Rodriguez summarized. That's quite different from our typical recipient profile. The objective analysis was making the decision clearer, but it wasn't resolving the personal complexity of the situation. Even if Madison's application didn't align perfectly with our mission and criteria, rejecting it would inevitably raise questions about my motivations and the Foundation's commitment to fair evaluation processes. "What are you thinking, Rebecca?" Dr. Harrison asked. "You know this applicant better than any of us, obviously, and you understand both her qualifications and the broader context better than we can from reviewing application materials alone." The question forced me to confront the fundamental tension I had been avoiding since discovering Madison's application. Was I capable of making an objective decision about my sister's fellowship request, or were 8 years of hurt and resentment inevitably going to influence my judgment? "I think Madison is a smart, capable person who would probably use fellowship funding effectively," I said slowly, trying to separate my assessment of her abilities from my feelings about our family history. "But I also think awarding her our fellowship would contradict everything we've built this foundation to accomplish." "How so?" Sarah Williams asked. "Because Madison Parker represents exactly the kind of educational privilege that creates barriers for other students. She's had access to family financial support, debt-free undergraduate and law school education, and the networking opportunities that come with economic security. Giving her additional funding means taking resources away from students who haven't had those advantages." The room was quiet as everyone absorbed the implications of what I was saying. The Henderson Foundation had been designed to counteract the very inequities that Madison's educational experience represented. Supporting her application would mean perpetuating the same system of advantages that had excluded me and thousands of other students from educational opportunities. But there's also the question of whether rejecting her application because of her family background constitutes a different kind of discrimination, Judge Chen pointed out. "We can't penalize applicants for having received family support any more than we can penalize them for lacking it." She was right, of course. The Foundation's mission was to support students who needed assistance, not to punish students who had received assistance elsewhere. Creating a policy that explicitly excluded applicants with family funding would be both impractical and potentially discriminatory. "What if we approached this differently?" Dr. Harrison suggested. "What if we evaluated Madison's application against our standard criteria without considering the family connection, but used this situation as an opportunity to clarify our selection priorities for future applicants?" It was a diplomatic solution that would preserve the integrity of our evaluation process while acknowledging the broader policy questions Madison's application had raised. "That makes sense," Superintendent Rodriguez agreed. "We need clear guidelines, about how to evaluate applicants who already have significant educational credentials or funding from other sources. Sarah Williams was already thinking ahead to implementation issues. We could develop more specific criteria about educational needs versus educational enhancement. Madison's application clearly falls into the enhancement category rather than the essential need category. The discussion was moving toward a resolution that felt both fair and principled. Madison's application would be evaluated according to criteria that applied to all candidates. But those criteria would take into account the Foundation's mission of supporting students who couldn't access graduate education without assistance. Are we comfortable with that approach, Rebecca? Judge Chen asked. Evaluating your sister's application according to our standard criteria, knowing that those criteria probably don't favor applicants in her position? I considered the question carefully. The approach they were suggesting would likely result in Madison's application being rejected, but not because of personal animosity or family history. It would be rejected because it didn't align with the Foundation's mission and priorities, criteria that would apply equally to any applicant with similar background and resources. I said finally, but I think I should recuse myself from the final vote to avoid any appearance of personal bias affecting the decision. Agreed, Dr. Harrison said immediately. This is exactly the kind of situation where recusal is appropriate, even when we're confident about someone's professional judgment. The remaining discussion focused on how to evaluate Madison's application against our established criteria for educational need, research potential, and mission alignment. Without my participation, the board members discussed her qualifications objectively and reached a conclusion that seemed inevitable once the relevant factors had been identified. Madison Parker was a qualified candidate who would probably succeed in a doctoral program and use her credentials effectively in her environmental law career. But she was not the kind of candidate the Henderson Foundation had been created to support. Our limited resources were intended for students who lacked access to family funding and educational opportunities, not for students seeking to enhance already privileged educational backgrounds. The decision was unanimous among the participating board members. Madison's application would be declined, with a standard letter explaining that while her qualifications were strong, the Foundation's current priorities focused on supporting students for whom the fellowship would provide essential access to graduate education rather than supplementary credentials. After the meeting ended and the other board members had left, Dr. Harrison remained behind to discuss the implications of what had just happened. That was handled well, he said, settling back into his chair with obvious relief. But I suspect this won't be the end of the situation. He was right, of course. Rejecting Madison's application would eventually lead to questions about the decision, especially if she learned about my connection to the Foundation. The family dynamics that had been dormant for 8 years were about to become much more complicated. Are you prepared for that? Dr. Harrison asked. I looked out the conference room windows at the Chicago skyline, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 8 years of building credentials and resources, creating an organization that could provide opportunities I had been denied, establishing myself as an expert on the very issues that had shaped my personal experience. I think so, I said. The Foundation was always about more than personal vindication. It was about creating systemic change that would help students facing similar barriers. And if Madison finds out about your involvement, then she'll finally understand what it felt like to be told that her educational goals weren't worth supporting, I replied. Maybe that's a conversation we should have had 8 years ago. The irony was perfect, but it was also painful. The sister who had accepted family educational investment without question was about to experience educational rejection from the sister whose investment had been denied. The power dynamics that had shaped our graduate school experiences were about to be completely reversed. But unlike our parents' arbitrary decision 8 years earlier, this rejection was based on principled criteria that applied equally to all applicants. Madison wasn't being denied funding because of personal bias or family favoritism. She was being denied funding because she didn't need it the way other applicants did, and because supporting her would contradict the Foundation's mission of educational equity. The decision felt both satisfying and sobering. Justice, perhaps, but the complicated kind that doesn't necessarily heal old wounds or resolve family dynamics. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the conference room, I realized that this moment represented both an ending and a beginning. An ending to 8 years of silence about family educational inequity, and a beginning of whatever would happen when Madison learned that the sister she had never defended was now in a position to make decisions about her educational future. The phone call that would change everything was probably only weeks away. The phone call came 3 weeks after Madison's rejection letter was sent out. I was in my office reviewing applications for our summer research internship program when my assistant buzzed me with a message that made my stomach drop. Madison Parker is on line 2. She says it's urgent family business. I stared at the blinking light on my phone for nearly a minute before picking up. 8 years of silence about our family's educational inequity was about to end, and I wasn't sure either of us was prepared for what that conversation would reveal. Jennifer? Madison's voice was tight with confusion and what sounded like barely contained anger. I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, I said carefully, though I suspected honesty was about to make both our lives much more complicated. I just received a rejection letter from the Henderson Foundation Educational Excellence Program for a doctoral fellowship I applied for. Do you know anything about that organization? The question was loaded with implications. Madison had clearly done some research after receiving her rejection, probably trying to understand why a candidate with her credentials had been turned down for what should have been a competitive but attainable fellowship. I'm familiar with their work, I replied, choosing my words carefully. They focus on educational equity and graduate student support. Jennifer, the Henderson Foundation was founded by someone named Dr. Rebecca Thompson. I've been researching her background, and some things about her story seem very familiar. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. What kind of things? Dr. Rebecca Thompson completed her PhD at Columbia in educational policy after being denied family funding for graduate school. She worked 3 jobs to pay for her education, while her sister received full financial support for law school. She founded the Henderson Foundation specifically to help students who face the same barriers she encountered. The silence stretched between us as the implications of what she had discovered sank in. Jennifer, Madison said finally, her voice much quieter now. Rebecca Thompson is you, isn't it? There was no point in denial. Madison had clearly pieced together enough information to understand the connection, and continuing to deflect would only make the conversation more difficult. Yes, I said simply. Dr. Rebecca Thompson is my professional name. I legally changed it during graduate school. You founded a scholarship organization? A major scholarship organization that I applied to without knowing? I did. The Henderson Foundation has awarded over $15 million in fellowships and grants over the past 5 years, and you rejected my application. It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. The board of directors rejected your application. I recused myself from the decision because of the obvious conflict of interest. But you were involved in the process. You knew I had applied, and you let them reject me. Madison's voice was rising now, the confusion giving way to anger as she processed the full scope of what had happened. Madison, your application was evaluated according to the same criteria we use for all candidates. The board members didn't know about our family connection when they made their decision. I disclosed it only after they had reviewed your materials. What? Criteria? I have excellent grades, strong recommendations, and a solid research proposal. What possible reason could there be for rejecting my application? This was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating for 8 years. The chance to explain to Madison how educational privilege worked, how family financial support created advantages that persisted throughout academic careers, and how her request for fellowship funding represented exactly the kind of educational inequality the foundation had been created to address. Madison, you received $60,000 per year in family funding for law school. You graduated debt-free and were able to pursue unpaid internships and networking opportunities that aren't available to students who need to earn income. You're now applying for additional funding to pursue supplementary credentials, while other applicants are seeking their first opportunity to access graduate education. So you're penalizing me for having family support? We're prioritizing students who don't have family support. There's a difference. The distinction was important, but I could tell from Madison's tone that she wasn't ready to appreciate the nuance. This is unbelievable, she continued. You've been holding a grudge for 8 years, and now you're using your position to get back at me for something that wasn't even my decision. Madison, this isn't about revenge. It's about using limited resources to support students who actually need them. You've already had access to family funding that most people never receive. Our fellowship is designed for students who don't have those advantages. I didn't know Mom and Dad were going to refuse to fund your doctoral program when they agreed to support my law school. I was 21 years old, focused on my own education. What was I supposed to do? Turn down their support and solidarity with you? It was a fair question, and one I had considered many times over the years. Madison had been young when our parents made their decision about educational funding, and she had no obligation to reject opportunities that were offered to her. But she also hadn't questioned the fairness of receiving support that was denied to her sister, or used her family's investment to advocate for more equitable treatment of both daughters. I'm not angry that you accepted their support, I said carefully. I'm disappointed that you never questioned why it was available to you, but not to me. I assumed they had their reasons. I trusted their judgment about what they could afford and what made sense for our family financially. And you never wondered why my educational goals were considered too risky while yours were considered a sound investment? Another silence, longer this time. When Madison spoke again, her voice was different, less defensive, more uncertain. I guess I didn't think about it that way. I mean, law school and doctoral programs are different. The career outcomes are more predictable with law degrees. Madison, I'm now a nationally recognized expert in educational policy. My research influences federal legislation and university policies across the country. I've received major grants from foundations that most academics never access. The career path they dismissed as impractical has been more successful than they predicted. I know. I've been reading about your work since I figured out who Dr. Rebecca Thompson really is. It's impressive, honestly. But that doesn't change the fact that you used your position to reject my application. We were talking in circles, both of us defending positions that reflected 8 years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. But underneath the defensive arguments, I could hear something else in Madison's voice, a recognition that the family dynamics she had taken for granted might not have been as fair as she had assumed. Madison, can I ask you something? Sure. When you applied to the Henderson Foundation, did you research the organization's mission and history? A pause. Not really. I found them through a directory of fellowship opportunities for environmental law students. I read the basic criteria and application requirements, but I didn't dig into the founder's background or anything. So you applied for funding from an organization dedicated to educational equity without learning about why it was created or who it was designed to help. The question was harsher than I had intended, but it highlighted something important about Madison's approach to educational opportunities. She had grown up assuming that funding sources existed for her benefit, without considering that resources might be intended for students with different backgrounds and needs. I applied because I met the stated qualifications, Madison said defensively. Academic excellence, research potential, commitment to using education for social good. I didn't think I needed to research the founder's personal story. The Henderson Foundation exists because students like me, students who are academically qualified but lack family financial support, often can't access graduate education at all. Our resources are limited, and we prioritize applicants for whom our funding makes the difference between pursuing advanced degrees and being excluded from higher education entirely. And you don't think I deserve consideration because I've already received family support? I think you deserve consideration, but not priority. There are students applying to our fellowship who are choosing between graduate school and basic survival. Students who are working multiple jobs to support their families while trying to complete undergraduate degrees. Students who have never had access to the kind of educational stability you've enjoyed since birth. Madison was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering the implications of what I was describing. I never thought about it that way, she said finally. I guess I assumed that if I was qualified, I would be competitive for any fellowship I applied for. That assumption is itself a form of privilege, Madison. Students who grow up without family financial support learn early that qualification doesn't guarantee opportunity. They learn that resources are limited and competition is fierce for students who don't have backup funding sources. So what am I supposed to do? Feel guilty for having family support? Apologize for opportunities I didn't choose to receive? You're supposed to understand how those opportunities shaped your path and consider how your choices affect other people who haven't had the same advantages. The conversation was becoming more honest than any we had ever had as adults, but it was also revealing how differently we understood family dynamics and educational equity. Jennifer, I know our parents' decision hurt you. I can see that now, in ways I probably couldn't when I was in college. But taking that hurt out on my fellowship application doesn't solve anything. I'm not taking anything out on your application. I'm running an organization according to principles that ensure our resources go to students who need them most. If those principles disadvantage applicants who already have advantages, that's exactly how they're supposed to work. But I'm your sister, which is exactly why I recused myself from the decision. The board members who rejected your application don't know you, don't know our family history, and don't care about our personal relationship. They evaluated your request according to our mission and concluded that our limited resources should go to students who don't have access to family funding. Madison was quiet again, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably taking notes or researching something while we talked. Jennifer, can I ask you something now? Of course. Do you think what happened to us, the way Mom and Dad handled our graduate school funding, was fair? It was the question that had been at the heart of everything for 8 years, but had never been directly addressed between us. No. I don't think it was fair. I think they made a decision based on their comfort level with different types of careers rather than objective assessment of our potential or needs. I think they created a system where one daughter received investment and support, while the other was expected to manage independently. And do you think I should have done something differently? I think you could have questioned their decision. You could have pointed out that denying me funding while providing it to you created an unfair advantage. You could have suggested alternative approaches that supported both of our educational goals. I was 21, Jennifer. I was focused on my own life and my own challenges. I didn't have the perspective to analyze family dynamics or advocate for educational equity. I understand that. But you're 30 now, and you've had years to consider whether the advantages you received were distributed fairly. This is the first time you've ever acknowledged that there might have been inequity in how our parents handled our education. Another long pause. You're right, Madison said finally. I should have thought about this more carefully over the years. I should have recognized that receiving family support, while you were denied the same support, created advantages that went beyond just the money itself. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of the fundamental unfairness that I had ever heard from anyone in my family, and it meant more than I had expected. Thank you for saying that. But Jennifer, what happens now? With us, I mean. Are we going to spend the rest of our lives fighting about decisions that were made 8 years ago? It was a good question, and one I had been avoiding while building my career and creating the foundation. The success I had achieved had provided vindication and validation, but it hadn't resolved the underlying family dynamics that had created the problems in the first place. "I don't want to fight about the past," I said honestly. "But I also can't pretend that the past didn't happen, or that it doesn't continue to affect how opportunities are distributed and how families make decisions about supporting their children's goals. So, what would it take for us to move forward?" Understanding. Recognition that educational opportunities aren't distributed fairly, even within families that should know better. Acknowledgement that some of us have had to work harder and sacrifice more because of decisions that were made based on factors other than merit or potential. And forgiveness? The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about family loyalty and personal responsibility, and the possibility of healing relationships that had been damaged by years of unaddressed inequity. "I think forgiveness is possible," I said carefully. "But it has to be based on understanding rather than forgetting. We can't just pretend that the past didn't matter and move forward without acknowledging what happened and why it was problematic." "Fair. Enough. And Jennifer, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. The foundation, your research, your career, all of it. I should have told you that years ago. Thank you. That means a lot. Even though you rejected my fellowship application." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. "Especially because we rejected your fellowship application. It means the foundation is working exactly as it should." We talked for another hour, addressing 8 years of unspoken tensions and misunderstandings. The conversation didn't resolve everything. Family dynamics that had been shaped over decades wouldn't be fixed in a single phone call. But it opened possibilities for a different kind of relationship going forward. Madison agreed to withdraw her application for future Henderson Foundation funding. Recognizing that her background and resources didn't align with our mission, she also expressed interest in supporting our work through other means, potentially serving on advisory committees or helping with outreach to students who might benefit from our programs. Most importantly, she committed to having conversations with our parents about the educational funding decisions that had shaped both our careers, conversations that were long overdue and might help prevent similar inequities from affecting other families. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 years earlier, I had been devastated by my family's refusal to support my educational goals. That devastation had motivated me to prove them wrong, to build something meaningful despite their lack of faith in my potential. The Henderson Foundation now supported over 200 students annually, providing fellowships and grants that made graduate education accessible to people who would otherwise be excluded by financial barriers. The research that had grown out of my personal experience was influencing policy decisions at universities across the country. But perhaps most importantly, the conversation with Madison had demonstrated that it was possible to use positions of power to create systemic change rather than perpetuate existing inequities. The Foundation's rejection of her application wasn't revenge. It was justice, based on principles that applied equally to all candidates. The irony wasn't lost on me that the sister who had benefited from family educational investment was now being denied additional funding by the sister whose investment had been refused. But unlike our parents' arbitrary decision 8 years earlier, this rejection was based on transparent criteria designed to promote equity rather than perpetuate privilege. Sometimes the most important lessons we learn aren't about achieving personal success, but about using that success to create opportunities for others who face the same barriers we once confronted. Sometimes the sweetest victory isn't proving the doubters wrong, but building systems that ensure fewer people have to face the same challenges that motivated our own determination. The Henderson Foundation would continue its work, supporting students who needed opportunities rather than students who simply wanted additional advantages. And Madison would continue her environmental law career, hopefully with a deeper understanding of how privilege operates in educational settings and a commitment to using her advantages more thoughtfully. As for our family relationships, those would require continued conversation and mutual effort to address decades of unexamined assumptions about fairness and support. But the foundation had been laid for something more honest and equitable than what we had grown up with. And sometimes, that's the most important foundation of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.